The Final Fantasy series has been considered by many to be the king of the JRPG genre. There was once a time when you knew you were in for a special experience when starting up a Final Fantasy game, and because these games are held in such high esteem from people around the world, ranking them is sure to rustle more than a few jimmies because every Final Fantasy game is someone's favorite Final Fantasy game. But today I want you to keep in mind that this is my personal list of where every mainline game in the series stands. And just because your favorite entry might be lower on my list, it doesn't necessarily mean I think it's a bad game. Also, 11 won't be here because it's the only game I never got to play due to it being an MMO and me being a poor teenager when it came out. So, with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, my name is BaoZakeruga, and today we are ranking every mainline Final Fantasy game from 1 through 15, except 11. Let's begin. If you know me, you already knew this one would be here in last place. I tried to like Final Fantasy 15, I truly did, but I couldn't get attached to the characters, I hated the story that wasn't even complete, and the half-ass open world was unenjoyable to traverse. I think what upset me most is that there was a lot of potential here. Arden had the potential to be the best antagonist the series had ever seen. Ludofreya could have had more than 10 minutes of screen time. We could have gotten to see an actual relationship between Noctis and his father instead of being told about it. If you want me to be completely honest, I didn't feel like I was playing a Final Fantasy game. Yes, every Final Fantasy entry has been different from the last as far back as 4 on the SNES, but this game just made me feel like I was playing another series completely, and not in a good way. Yes, there were many issues with the game's development and they wanted to do more, but the fact remains this will likely forever be the definitive Final Fantasy 15 experience, and I for one cannot stand it. I'm sure you've all heard the common complaints about Final Fantasy 13 a million times by now if you haven't experienced them for yourself. The game is one big corridor, a lot of the world terminology is confusing, the characters are unlikable, and so on. While I agree with some of these to a degree, I didn't dislike 13 to the extent many others do. If anything, I felt 13 was alright while I was playing it, but it's also the hardest game in the series to replay, of course just speaking personally. The characters have interesting growth, but I feel like after that growth happens, they're just kinda flat. Like they're just there for the sake of being there now. It's hard to put into words. But besides that, I also never liked the combat in this game. Originally, it was a means to an end because I really wanted to see where the story went, but I never had any genuine fun and just bared with it. It's no secret I much prefer my RPGs turn-based, but I kept an open mind here, and the paradigm system unfortunately, sadly just never clicked with me. I don't find 13 to be as horrendous as many others do, but it's still a low light for the series for me. I have an interesting history with Final Fantasy XII. Upon release, I actually hated this game, almost unfairly. I fell in love with the series before this point, and doing away with the turn-based combat was a borderline sin to teenage me. From the moment I entered combat, I was just annoyed that I was essentially playing an offline MMO. My initial dislike for this game is actually why I was hesitant to pick up Xenoblade at first years later. But being older and a bit wiser and open-minded, I gave Final Fantasy XII another try years later. And I liked it a lot more than when I was a teenager. I still don't think the shift in combat was necessary, and while I'm still not the biggest fan of the gameplay changes, the more challenging bosses in this game that require actual strategy can be pretty fun. And that's where this battle system truly shines, which is why it's a shame most of the game is a cakewalk. You might have noticed I haven't touched on the story at all yet, and that's because it's just kinda there. They tried going for a super political plot with inspiration from Star Wars, and it just isn't that interesting. There's ways to make politics interesting and engaging like in Mobile Suit Gundam and Game of Thrones, but they really missed the mark here. I similarly feel that most of the characters aren't too memorable either. Balthier can be cool and suave, and Ash's story of a princess trying to get her kingdom back is alright, but they were the only real standouts for me. I can understand Square trying something new with 12, but for me it was a swing and a miss. Alright, so unlike the previous entries which all have varying big issues for me, from this point on the games are all good to varying degrees. and there's no better entry to start this section off than with 3. There's nothing really at all wrong with Final Fantasy 3. It's an overall solid game, giving us the now iconic job system, and it introduced the fan favorite summoners into the series for the first time. If I had to choose one grievance, it's that the story is really just there to get you from point A to B. For better or worse, this game is just one big pile of average, at least compared to some other entries. Nothing too amazing, nothing too bad. Well, except for the excellent soundtrack. Eternal Wind is still one of my favorite overworld themes in any game, and the regular boss theme is one of the best in the series. If this was a list based on top soundtracks, 3 would be ranked a lot higher, but unfortunately this is not such a list. So for today, it'll take the number 11 spot instead. I know, this is probably blasphemous for a lot of you. Final Fantasy VII was a lot of people's introductions to RPGs in general, and is responsible for popularizing the genre in the West. But I played the series in order, so 7 for me wasn't some never before seen experience. If I had to describe my feelings for Final Fantasy VII in one statement, it would be this: a great RPG, but an average Final Fantasy game. In a series of phenomenal games, 7 is just good. At times, I will admit, really good. The opening bombing segment is one of the strongest intros to any RPG I've ever played, and the OST is great and fits the mood for whatever you're doing or wherever you are. Like I said, for me, 7 is a good game. The story and characters just didn't resonate with me to the degree that they did with many others, to the point I consider it one of the greatest games I ever created. And that's okay. It's still a great game. As basic as it may seem by today's standards, the original Final Fantasy is still a solid experience worth playing. The music is timeless, each area having a fitting theme that really puts you in the scene, all despite the limitations of the hardware Nobuo Uematsu had to work with. The game starts with you making a party of 4 characters of your choice, you choosing their classes and names. It's a role-playing game in the truest sense, with obvious Dungeons & Dragons influences everywhere. And obviously in the year 2020, everything this game did has been done time and time again to the point where it's now mundane. But back in 1987, a lot of the things Final Fantasy offered were major deals. Simple things like buying equipment from town shops, having an airship to fly around the world map, and even a simple yet effective twist with the final boss of the game. It's easy to look at this game now and scoff at the fact I'd rank it higher than the vastly more detailed subsequent entries in the series that would eventually spawn, but in my opinion, this game holds up better than probably any other game from this generation, and that's really saying something. Okay, I know a lot of people hate Final Fantasy II, and I mean a lot of you guys hate this game, but I personally love it. Weird progression system and all. Although Final Fantasy IV is where the series truly took off as a narrative-driven affair, 2 is where they first really attempted it. In my opinion, they did really good. The game begins with your party being mowed down while escaping the recently sacked home village, and the story doesn't get too much happier from there. It's a shockingly dark RPG than you might expect, especially for a game from 1988. But let's talk about the infamous leveling system real quick, or rather, the lack of one. For those that don't know, in Final Fantasy II, you don't gain levels. Your party's stats and affinities for both weapons and magic simply go up the more you use them. Want more HP? Let enemies hit you. Want to get better with swords? Keep hacking away enemies until you're a blade master. It's definitely different than most other RPGs, but I liked it, and I can't mention Final Fantasy II without bringing up the amazing concept that is the Souls of Rebirth dungeon added to the GBA version of the game. I won't go into details because of spoilers, but it's one of the most creative extras I've ever seen added to a port of a game. Final Fantasy VIII has always been a game that sparked debate. The draw system confuses many players to this day, and the plot twist with the party has left many of fans scratching their head or face palming. I can acknowledge how many flaws this game has, but that doesn't change the fact that it's always held a special place in my heart. Although it was through a demo and I didn't get to experience the full game until later in life, Final Fantasy VIII was my first RPG ever. I was fascinated that games could look so detailed and actually tell a narrative similar to an anime. Fast forward years later when I was older and got to experience the full game for myself, and I fell in love all over again. Squall to this day is one of the most relatable characters I've found in any type of media, and his relationship with Rinoa could have easily kept me playing alone. I also gotta note that 8's battle theme is my favorite in the entire series. It made even the most mundane random encounters feel like a tense struggle. Yes, Final Fantasy VIII can be messy, but it's a beautiful mess. While Final Fantasy III introduced the job system, 5 is where we got to see the full potential of jobs. The amount of jobs was boosted to 22 or 26 if you're playing the GBA version, and you can now mix and match them to get creative and make a party that fits any situation. Want a white mage that can hit as hard as a monk? You can do that. Want a ninja with time magic? The sky's the limit. And I'll be the first to admit the story and characters of 5 aren't the strongest in the series, especially after coming off the heels of the amazing Final Fantasy IV, but the gameplay is so fun here that it doesn't bring down the experience one bit. The gameplay left such a lasting impression that both Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler take the job mixing formula in 5 and use it as the base of their gameplay. That should tell you just how great this system is, and some would argue 5 is still to this day the pinnacle of Final Fantasy's gameplay. As mentioned in the previous entry, Final Fantasy IV is amazing. It's really where the series found its identity, at least in my opinion. Final Fantasy as a series today is known for dramatic set pieces, larger-than-life characters, and unforgettable tales of good and evil. And 4 is the true first entry to have all of these in spades. Cecil's tale of redemption from bloody Dark Knight to righteous Paladin will forever be a classic I love revisiting. I think what made Final Fantasy IV truly special, not just for this series but RPGs in general, is that it's the first entry where your party members had real dynamic personalities and motivations. Cecil is racked with regret over the evil deeds he's done in the name of his king. Kain is Cecil's best friend but harbors jealousy towards him because of his unrequited love for Rosa, who is deeply in love with Cecil. These are fully realized characters with motivations, backstories, and most importantly, flaws, which was a big deal for an RPG from 1991. I played this entry across multiple platforms, remakes, and remasters, and every playthrough is just as good as the last. Final Fantasy IV has truly stood the test of time and is a must-play game even today. For the longest among both hardcore and casual gamers alike, if you were to ask what title comes to mind when you think of Final Fantasy, you'd be likely to hear 7 or perhaps 8 or 10. 9 has always been a bit of a black sheep of the series, coming out on the PS1 just months after the PS2 had already been released, and ditching a more grounded in reality approach both 7 and 8 went for in their aesthetics. I had no idea what to expect going into 9, given its unique look and the fact to that point the more vocal part of the Final Fantasy fanbase never talked about it. But what I ended up experiencing was one of the most heartfelt stories and some of the most unforgettable characters the series has to offer. And things get shockingly dark in this game too. Don't let the colorful and whimsical design approach fool you. By the end of 9, the body count gets pretty high. If I had to pick a singular thing that makes 9 a standout must-play RPG, it would be Vivi. There's no exaggeration when I say Vivi might be the most lovable, well-written character I've come across in an RPG, and the story is sure to make you emotional by the end. I'm a bit of a sucker for good stories on what it means to live, independent will, and the meaning of life itself, and Vivi's tale hits all the right notes for me. Final Fantasy IX is laid out like a play, and when the credits rolled I had to stand up and clap and having witnessed such a well-done journey. If you've never played Final Fantasy XIV due to its nature as an MMO, you might be surprised it's this high. For those that have played 14 up to and including Shadowbringers, however, you may even consider the number 3 spot too low for this game. I have to admit up front that due to being an MMO, Final Fantasy XIV has a bit of an unfair advantage over the other titles. It can constantly add new music, characters, and story, all while expanding its lore. It can keep improving itself more and more, which it definitely has. The original Final Fantasy XIV and the current one are light years apart, and if I had to describe the current state of 14 in a singular statement, it would be this: a love letter to Final Fantasy and its longtime fans. There's so many references, inspirations, and callbacks to every single Final Fantasy entry here that it's staggering. But more than that, 14 stands on its own as an engrossing tale with many moments that tug on the heartstrings. Where the game truly hits its stride is in the Heavensward expansion, which deals with an eons-long blood feud between the people of Ishgard and dragons. What starts as a simple story of people defending their homeland from evil dragons unravels into a deeper tale of betrayal, the revelation that Ishgard's entire history and culture is based on a lie, and a great example of the deterioration that can be caused to oneself and everything around you when obsessed with nothing but revenge. It's an amazing story to see from beginning to end, and many would argue that the newest expansion, Shadowbringers, goes even further beyond what even Heavensward achieved. Final Fantasy XIV isn't just a side story MMO that can be ignored, and more than earns a spot among the best of the best as a mainline entry. In many ways, Final Fantasy X was the end of an era while being the start of a new one. It was the last turn-based Final Fantasy game while being the first with voice acting and facial expressions. It was the first to do away with the 2D backdrops and world map of past games and give us a connected 3D environment to explore. Even the big theme of the game is death and rebirth, accepting that you can't change the past and carry on no matter how tough things get because your life is your story, and you should live it to the best of your ability. Final Fantasy X tells a beautiful story, one of the best I've had the pleasure of experiencing in any game. To this day, it's the only game to make me cry, but I think I have a special connection to 10 because its themes resonated with me at the perfect time in my life when I was going through a big transition and having a rough time. Being forced to live with an abusive father after my parents' divorce while also changing high schools left me in a very dark place, and Titus' story of being forced out of his home into a foreign and strange place where he was all alone made me feel an immediate connection to him. I grew genuinely attached to him, Yuna, and the rest of the party over my time with the game. They all had their own issues and losses to deal with, and seeing them try their best to deal with them while also trying to save the world made me want to try my best as well in my then current situation. And I think that's one of my biggest takeaways from this game that I still hold dear to me today. Often in life you have to deal with loss and things out of your control, and things will often never be the same again. But you do your best to deal with it regardless. Final Fantasy X may not hold the #1 spot on our list today, but it's still one of the best not only the series, but the genre has to offer. Many people have an RPG that they hold as a standard for the rest of the genre. For me, that game is Final Fantasy VI. From the opening segment to the credits, this game was masterful in everything it set out to do, and every playthrough I do solidifies this thought in my head more and more each time. Many argue, and rightfully so, that Final Fantasy VI doesn't have a main character, that most of the main cast gets so much development and screen time that they're all the main characters equally. And while some like Terra, Locke, and Celeste get more time in the limelight than others, this is overall true and one of VI's strongest points. You'll fall in love with Terra and her journey of discovering what it means to be a human and not a weapon or an instrument of destruction, but then get to know Locke, who at first glance seems to be just a womanizing thief, when in actuality, he feels driven to help every woman he comes across after the love of his life was almost killed due to his own recklessness. 6 has a huge cast and most of them have a backstory and development that will keep your interest. But my personal favorite has to be the story of the brothers Edgar and Sabin. These two are heirs to Figaro Castle, with Edgar being the active ruler and Sabin traveling the world to hone his martial arts skills. It's revealed in the flashback that on their father's deathbed, Edgar flipped a coin to determine which one of them would be the one to rule after their father's passing, with Edgar getting the supposed short end of the stick, with Sabin free to do as he wants. But it's alluded to that Edgar used a double-sided trick coin to ensure his brother would get his true wish of roaming free and seeing the world, while he himself would stay as the ruler of Figaro instead. Final Fantasy VI's main plot is great, but it's these smaller personal tales that truly make this game special. It's not just the story and characters that make this game good though. 6 is also one of my favorite games in the series to play, and the lore of 6 ties directly into the battles. In the world of Final Fantasy VI, magic has been gone from the world so long that it's now considered a myth. But after certain in-game events leading to beings known as Espers being released into the world, your party can now learn magic from then on and use them in battle. Everyone has a certain role in 6, whether it be Locke, who's a thief, or Sabin, who uses fighting game-esque command inputs, and the magic system takes us further, letting your in-game party be however you want them to be. Final Fantasy VI is just a definition of a phenomenal game. The music, gameplay, characters, story, and everything in between all work together to create a genuinely fun and enjoyable experience for the player. It's an ageless experience that every RPG fan should play at some point or other. The Final Fantasy series means a lot to many of us, and I hope that you enjoyed this video even if one of your favorite entries didn't make it high on the list. I want to hear not only what your favorite Final Fantasy games are, but if there's any game or a specific scene that got you emotional or means a lot to you personally. Thanks guys, I'll see you next time. A big thank you to my patrons this month, Westtown HD, Nightmare Alpha, and Buttermilk Mike. Your help is always appreciated and it helps the channel stay alive. Thank you guys so much. And if you want to become a patron, look in the description below for the link to my Patreon. See ya.